Whenever you're ready.
Oh,
It's
okay.
up and running.
It's up and running. Okay. All right. Welcome, everyone. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce Greg Hakim. So let's say a little bit about Greg. So he is a professor in the Atmospheric Sciences Department at the University of Washington. He does a broad range of research, from understanding climate, including by reconstructing the past, which is some of what he's going to be talking about today, all the way to looking at subseasonal forecasting using linear inverse modeling and other tools. So that's where we've chatted quite a bit on with that limb overlap. A little bit about his background. So he did his undergraduate degrees in math and atmospheric science, and then he obtained his PhD in atmospheric science from the University at Albany, or SUNY Albany. There's so many different names, one of those names. After that, he did an ASP postdoc fellowship at NCAR, and then he officially joined UW, not UW, that's us, UW, in 1999. And he has quite the impressive record. I just checked your website, and you're at 98 publications, which is pretty wild. And also 2 textbooks. And those of you who have done an undergraduate in or program or many other atmospheric science programs, you likely have the book that he is one of the co-authors on in undergraduate dynamics, right? The Bolton and Hakim. So thank you so much for coming, and I will let you take over.
Thank you, Steph, for that generous introduction. Thank all of you for coming today. For those of you that I've met, especially the grad students, Rudra, thank you for being such a wonderful host. I appreciated that. It's been about 15 or 20 years since the last time I was here, and it's been a really fun day, so thank you all. So the background image here requires a little bit of explanation because I think it's going to touch on motivating what I'm going to talk about for most of the talk, and also where I think we could go next. And I'm more excited about integrating climate and weather research than I've ever been in my career. I think we are at a fantastic time right now. So we're looking at, I think it's a farmer in New England, and you'll notice there is a volcanic haze in the background. This is the year without a summer in 1816, after Mount Tambora erupted in 1815. And there was a summer frost, or a freeze, on a field of young corn. And so the 2 things we can get out here, I'm going to show you can actually start to resolve the planetary scale circulation that occurred in this event year by year during that time from climate proxy records. And I think where we might be able to go is to start to talk about statistics of extreme weather events using those reconstructions. So the motivation is we need much longer global gridded climate data sets. That's kind of the shortest pitch I can give you for what I'm going to talk about in the first half of this talk. The instrumental period is short, it's strongly forced, and reanalysis products that we all know and love and use in our day-to-day research have non-climate variability. There is strong temporal variation in the observations that go into those reanalyses that introduce non-climate artifacts. And that limits our ability, because these are still huge computational problems, limits our ability to mitigate that or to reduce that problem. We're interested in making decadal forecasts, but we really lack the ability to properly initialize the coupled climate state. To produce those forecasts, we also are lacking a large sample for verification. So for those of us that also have a foot in the weather world, the reason why weather forecasts have gotten monotonically better over the last 50 years is because we have repeated out-of-sample validation of those forecasts, and we're constantly learning. With the Argo floats being 20 years old, full sampling of the ocean is limited to that. If we can only forecast over that time period for our decadal forecast, the N is like 1 to 3, right? It's really hard to learn. We need a much, much larger sample over a longer period of time, and especially when we get out of the period where the climate system is strongly forced, and we can get at this variability that's perhaps internal. And finally, our climate models are tuned to the instrumental era. So if we really want to test how well they perform, we need to have a better idea of what happened in the past, and that's going to come from paleoclimate proxies. So what a lot of this talk is about, and by the way, can you all hear me well in the back of the room? Excellent, thank you. I much prefer going without the mic. we're going to be formally combining in a statistical framework information that comes from climate models, which obey the laws of physics as we've encoded them, but they're not connected to any individual climate state in the past, with climate proxies, which have recorded what happened in the past, but they're not necessarily constrained by the laws of physics, and they're quite noisy. So after that, the rest of the talk is going to be what I would call a bit of a sampler platter. If you don't like sampler platter talks, we're going to go from top to top. I'm going to apologize in advance, but rather than do a deep dive on any one of these topics, I thought I'd give you a taste of what we can do with the Last Millennium Reanalysis, which I'll introduce first. Tambora and the mystery eruption in 1809, which preceded it, which I think is actually more interesting. I'll talk a little bit about Atlantic, multi-decadal variability, sea ice, and we'll see if we get to those last two topics. So very briefly, without picking on anyone in particular, this is kind of the way climate synthesis was done in the past, and it's actually still done today. Individual climate proxy records. So you go to a location, you measure something like an ice core oxygen isotope record, you go back in time, you relate that to temperature, ice volume, and then you match up these wiggles, and there's a story about what happened to the climate over the last, in this case, 11,000 years, over the Holocene. And there are quantitative approaches of synthesizing and combining this information, which also has a long history, especially in the tree ring community going back to the 1960s. And that led up to climate field reconstructions, most famously Nan et al. Starting in the late 1990s, which allowed maps to start to be produced, comparing centennial scale variability between, say, the Little Ice Age in the latter part of the Common Era with the medieval climatology around 1,000 years prior. So these techniques use what are called inverse models, where you calibrate the proxies to instrumental temperature, and then knowing the proxies, you predict the temperature. That is, climate is a function of the proxies. That's not actually the way it works. So the way we do it in data assimilation, which is how this Last Millennium Reanalysis works, is we model the proxies given the climate information. So given temperature, given precipitation, or given oxygen isotope records, we predict what was actually measured in the proxy archive. So we can make a direct comparison. So I'm going to spare you most of the math. For those of you that know a bit about data assimilation, that's the Kalman filter right there. On the left and on the right are the two essential ingredients. On the left, information from climate models. And on the right, what actually happened as recorded by these climate proxy archives. So the archives are things like tree rings, ring width, late wood density. We have information from oxygen isotopes in coral records, mostly in the tropics. We have archives in ice cores, along with a bunch of others. And the question is, how do we compare these two things, and how do we combine them? So the way we compare them is using what are called proxy system models. This is the modeling I was talking about a moment ago, where given the climate states, we make a prediction of what the proxies are, and then we compare that with the actual proxy value. That is what was recorded in the geochemistry. And then we have to weight those two things against one another. That's the Kalman filter. And spread that information from the locations where the proxies are located globally in a statistically consistent way and multivariate, right? So we're doing it's a true multivariate analysis. And then if we're doing online data assimilation, as we do in the weather world, we move forward in time and we carry the memory of past observations through the forecast model into the future. And for these problems, that turns out to be computationally extraordinarily expensive, so we're mostly doing the offline one. I'll speak more about that in a moment. So some key differences from the standard reanalyses that you're familiar with. The observations are a whole lot more complicated. That's probably the most concise way to say this. These are not thermometers, they are not anemometers, but they contain an encoding of the climate information. That's all we've got. We need to make the most of it. The models. Well, they do have the physics, but their forecast skill on the time scales of these proxies. So the proxies that I'll be using are annually resolved. They have annual resolution. And the ability of climate models to make informative forecasts on a time scale of a year is still quite limited. So it's a very, and for the large ensembles that we need for this problem, we are spending a lot. Basically, it's prohibitively expensive to get very little forecast skill. But there are some ways around that using emulators. Yeah, so this is a hard problem. I've been working on it this is pretty close to the 20-year anniversary of when I started working on this. But the upside is it's low dimensional. Basically, the number of observations we have is relatively small, and especially when we use emulators, we can start to do large samples. So Last Millennium Reanalysis has gone through essentially 3 generations. We had the prototype, the update to that using an updated proxy database, and then online just a couple of years ago. The essential components of the proxies come from a community-curated database called the Pages 2K. This is basically 700 records. We augmented that in the 2019 study with a much larger tree ring database. Proxy system models are still relatively crude. We have bivariate seasonal modeling of the tree ring records, but for the most part, this is linear statistical modeling. And both the data and the code for the LMR are all freely available publicly. Uncertainty quantification is really essential to this process. Why should you trust what we have to say with these reconstructions? So we withhold 25% of the proxies for independent validation. We're going to predict those values after we've done the reconstruction. So they will not inform on the reconstruction at all. And prior to the instrumental era, that's really the only thing we have in order to assess whether we have an accurate reconstruction or not. We used last millennium simulations, so over the period from 850 to 1850, there's a relatively large and growing archive of these model simulations now that we can randomly sample for our prior estimate of what the climate was. And then we have these forward models, which are calibrated for the proxies during the instrumental era. We do a Monte Carlo approach over all of this sampling to give us about 10,000 reanalyses. That's certainly not something you can do with ERA5. You get one. This is just to give you a sense of the spatial distribution of the proxies. You don't have to read the details of the legend. The colors show you the different types of archives. The green triangles are most abundant. Those are tree rings. On the right, you see how abundant they are as a function of time. So here we are, latter part of the 20th century. The last 400 years is really well resolved, and then it drops off pretty steadily from there. By the time we get prior to about 1,000 years ago, it's starting to get relatively sparse. So we do actually reconstruct the last 2,000, but the focus is on the last 1,000 years. The difference between the top and the bottom is just the community curated process changed from 2013 to 2017. I'll show you a comparison of reconstructions based upon those two. Again, the key proxies: tree rings in the exotropics, corals in the tropics, ice cores at high latitudes, and in some tropical locations. And then if you throw in, there's another 2,000 tree ring records that are more sensitive to precipitation or soil moisture technically. It doesn't change the story a whole lot. So the validation, I'm going to show you validation against instrumental products. As I mentioned, we're going to have validation on the proxies themselves, both in and out of sample. And I'll show you two measures of goodness of fit: a traditional correlation coefficient and something called the coefficient of efficiency, which not only gets at timing of signals, but also errors in and bias in the mean and the variance, and that's actually unbounded below. So it's a much more sensitive measure of skill. Okay, so on to the results. So what we're looking at here is a time series from 1880 to 2000. of the LMR. In the black line, global mean temperature, about 1 degree C warming. We stop at 2000 because the proxy archives really drop off after that. We've accumulated these records over the last 50 to 60 years, and there just are not that many. As a matter of fact, it really starts to drop off after about 1985 or so. What I want you to take away from this is that the black line is essentially statistically indistinguishable from all of these other lines, which are the instrumental estimates, different instrumental estimates of the global mean temperature. So there's not exact agreement among those products, so we form what we call the consensus estimate of the instrumental data. And the LMR pretty much is in the pack with the rest of them, which, when you think about it, is fairly remarkable that we're dealing with these biological, geochemical archives of the climate system. We can basically recover what we've got with instrumental data. Okay, well, that's just the global mean. How about spatial skill? I motivated this by saying we want to have a multivariate global gridded data set. So this shows for 2 meter air temperature, the verification of the product globally, where it's grayed out. The verification data set, in this case the Berkeley Earth data set, is incomplete for a detailed analysis. Correlation on the left, so where you see red, darker reds, closer to 1, higher skill. And the much more sensitive metric, coefficient of efficiency, still, it's mostly red over nearly the entire globe. So we have skill not only in the global mean, but also in the spatial distribution of temperature anomalies over the instrumental period. Here's an example of we can get information in the middle troposphere. So our beloved 500 hectopascal surface, we can reconstruct that fairly faithfully compared to the 20th century reanalysis from NOAA, which uses specified sea surface temperatures and pressure assimilation every 6 hours. If you average that back to a year, verify the Last Millennium Reanalysis, it's pretty good, especially in the tropics. Okay, well, so that's what we have during the instrumental period, but how about if we go pre-instrumental? That's shown here. So this is an evaluation over the period from 0 to 1879. Top, this is the proxies that were assimilated. Bottom are the ones that were not assimilated.
Sorry, Greg, can I ask a question
Yeah.
first? What are the boundary conditions on the Last Millennium Reanalysis? Like, what are you using as input? So it's the 75 proxies, but also I assume like some kind of estimates of volcanism or?
No, so it's just whatever comes from the climate model. So we have those Last Millennium simulations.
And what are the boundary conditions on those?
So those are the full forced simulations. So they have all of the aerosol forcing from volcanic eruptions, which is the bulk of the variability of the Last Millennium, and trace gas variability, and I think that's most of it. Yeah,
Okay.
There's maybe a little bit of solar variability, but that's small.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
And so that's what contributes the most to
That's
the
what's
variability.
causing the
prior.
variability that we're talking about. That's what I'm.
Yeah, so what we're doing is we're going into those simulations and we're randomly sampling from those. We say, give me 100 years from the last 1,000 years. And that's going to be my estimate for every single year that we reconstruct. So in the absence of proxy informations, we have no signal. All of the signal in time is coming from the proxies.
Okay.
The spatial information is coming from models. Yeah, Dan.
Yeah, so like on the previous plot where you're looking at the drop-off of skill in mid-latitudes, is that a function of the strength of the proxy response to the variable itself, or is that a function of model bias in these? Like how do you, I mean, I'm sure it's a little of both, but where does that break down?
Yeah, well, so I can't give you a quantitative answer, but I think you've got two of the pieces that are relevant to answering the question. Some of it is model bias and the covariance between the surface estimates and 500 hectopascals. The other piece, which I've highlighted, actually I didn't put it on here, these are where the moisture sensitive trees are, so there may be a bit of, we are not modeling some of those proxies as well as we should, so there's some bias in how we're modeling them. And the other bit is 20th century reanalysis may have some problems here. I took out the slide that shows the comparison of 2 meter air temperature of the ERA 20C and the 20CR with GISTEMP. Not so hot over land. It's actually not good at all. So that's the other piece of it, is what you validate against is actually part of the answer. So this is just a statistical summary to show you, I think, two important things. This summarizes what was on the maps, and it shows you in the prior, if we look at the correlation for assimilating proxies in the top, not assimilating in the bottom. So this is where there's no net. This is the most important comparison. Our prior has a big spike at 0. Our prior doesn't know anything. It cannot predict these proxies. And what we're looking at in the blue distribution is if we look after 1880, we see there's skill, there's correlation. It's not over here at 1, but it's positive. We are able to predict those proxies without assimilating them. That's out of sample. And if we go prior to 1880, outside the time when we built the proxy system models, 1880 present, we get basically the same distribution. So that red curve is as far out of sample as you can get. That is, if things were going to go wrong, it would show up there. We're predicting things that we haven't seen. Okay, so now let's get to what I think is the exciting part. Let's use this data set for looking at climate variability. So here's what we see for the global mean temperature over the last 2,000 years. There are two curves on here. One was from our initial estimate, and the red one was the update. The main difference being the proxies that participated in the reconstruction. They're fairly similar. So to leading order, what you see here is a millennial scale cooling trend into a peak of cooling in what is commonly known as the Little Ice Age. So that's a robust feature of the reconstructions. One that is not is around 1,000 years ago, our first estimate, consistent with many other people who had done similar exercises, was the medieval climate anomaly, this warming that occurred in the medieval period. Doesn't show up now. And this is when the Vikings were running around the North Atlantic, right? They were setting up houses in Greenland. Turns out it was warm, but probably in very geographically limited regions, like the North Atlantic. It probably was not a hemispheric phenomenon. So down bottom, we're comparing for the northern hemisphere mean temperature, the LMR in the bold red line with other reconstructions, and the shading area shows you the uncertainty from the LMR. And you'll notice that uncertainty gets bigger as we go back in time. As we have fewer and fewer proxies and we go back in time, the error grows, but we can tell you what it is. We can even talk about the consistency between signal to noise as we go back in time. And the LMR has that consistency. Whereas most of the rest of these estimates are deterministic. They're single estimates, so it's hard to know whether, for example, this is real or not. But we would say this is a really low probability outcome.
I've never noticed that 1450 dip before. Do people now say that's the start of the Little Ice Age or anything like that?
It's a moving target depending on who you talk to. But yeah, I would say the Little Ice Age is probably a little later. It's mostly due to stochastic clustering of volcanic events that's produced the Little Ice Age. And so yeah, that's actually, thanks for the cue, Matt. Most of the big dips you see here are volcanically induced. And you can see they're clustering a little bit more here. So that cooling was kind of archived in the slow part of the climate system that led to this neoglacial period in the late Comet era. So let's go right here. So right here is one of the biggest spikes down where we had two major eruptions, one of which was motivated on the tidal sun you probably have heard about, the year without a summer. That was Mount Tambora in 1815. But that was actually preceded by what's known as the mystery eruption. We don't know where exactly it was. We don't know when exactly it was, although people seem to be homing in on December 1808, which actually fits with what we've got here pretty well. So this is relative to 1809, that's what 0 means, and then we're going years after the eruption, and we're compositing the global mean temperature, and each curve shows a different way of doing the reconstruction. Using a different climate model as our estimate for the climate dynamics, the climate statistics, how we spread the information around, and a different instrumental data set for calibrating the proxy system models. So this captures a lot of the uncertainty we have in the analysis. And of course, for each one of those, we have the range of uncertainty that comes from randomly sampling over the proxies and each one of these models. What you see is that although there's a bit of uncertainty in how large the signal was, it's pretty clear we got a lot of cooling with that 1809 mystery eruption. And Mount Tambora was really a reinforcing shot 6 years later that just kept things cold. So this is a really cold time in Earth's recent history, and that's why the farmer and his wife were struggling to grow corn in New England. And there was actually global periods of food insecurity at that time. And notice how long this lasts. This lasts for 15 or 20 years. So the 19th century was a cold time. But now we're getting to, this is the weather, the exciting weather connection here. We're getting closer. So now we have the spatial distribution of temperature anomalies in the colors, 1808, 1809, so on and so forth. And in the contours, we have the 500 hectopascal heights anomalies. And so what you see is, in the year before the eruption, there's some random internal climate variability. The eruption goes off, and then we see this large signal in the next few years concentrated over the Pacific and North America. This looks like, in fact, a classic PNA pattern, which really concentrated the cooling over Western North America. And I think that's probably why the settlers were living predominantly on the East Coast. There was no remarkable archive, either through our work or as far as I'm aware, any other hardships along the colonies in the East Coast during this time. But there was for Mount Tambora, which affected things further east. So this is what we're able to do now, and I think with perhaps deep learning emulators, we might be able to take this down and start looking at weather statistics using, say, the LMR's boundary conditions for large sample simulations of weather events.
And so just to clarify, this is not coming from like changes in aerosols in these simulations. This is coming from simulation, or
so
that's why the question I was asking about boundary conditions, right? Is this?
Yeah, so those volcanic aerosols are, in those model simulations, are definitely producing cold states. And they show up in our ensemble. And they yield the covariance statistics between different places and different climate variables. What they don't tell us is what does the time series look like? That's what the proxies have. So those volcanic aerosols are giving us spatial relationships in the data. The proxies are giving us the temporal ordering of what the time series and also spatial distributions look like.
Okay, think about that some more.
John, did you have
I wonder if there's any oral traditions in the Native American tribes, like the Mandan and others in the central part of the continent, that would testify to an abrupt cold in the early part of the 19th century.
I'd love to know that too.
Yeah, because there's bound to be somebody who knows that.
Yeah, so you may have heard these stories about how Frankenstein, Mary Shelley wrote it based on, they had these spectacular sunsets for like a decade. If they're in Cornell, they actually have a number of paintings by artists at this time, and apparently the reds and the sunsets in the paintings around this time are spectacular. They're noteworthy. So there are these natural linkages with other fields, social science in particular. Yes?
Real quick question. Tree rings used in this particular event?
Yes.
Okay. If you take them out, you still get to see the DNA?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the tropical corals are really good at tapping into that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Do you
Yes.
find that with how little data is assimilated from Africa, do you think that changes in Africa are more reactionary to triggers that might form in like the mid-latitudes in the northern hemisphere?
Yeah, this is a good point. Yeah, so these results are sensitive to the distribution of that proxy network, the proxy availability, and it is spatially concentrated in places where we are able to annually resolve. Because that was one of the limits we used on the LMRs. We want to have every record that we're using annually resolved. Yeah, there are places we don't have it. A lot of the southern hemisphere, for example, is lacking that information. So yeah, that's definitely a caveat in the results. But it's in the ensemble error estimates. You'll just see bigger errors in those geographical locations. This is just another way of illustrating on a polar stereographic projection. You can see very clearly the PNA pattern. For this is one particular year, this is in 1810. And this just shows you it's a robust pattern. If you change The climate model that's used for the ensemble prior, you get a similar result. You know, the details of the PNA matter to some of these details, but the fact that it's there do not. So I would say you can have pretty high confidence that in 1810, there was a PNA pattern that's related to this volcanic eruption affecting the northern hemisphere climate, and also affecting Arctic sea ice. I'm going to say more about this in a little bit. This is in fact composite over 26 eruptions. The one or two that I showed you are in there. It's a very, very noisy signal. So relative to the initial time of the volcanic eruption, we get a jump up in the sea ice, so we get more sea ice in the Arctic. It's more extensive, and that signal lasts for about a decade. But look at how much scatter there is here. There's a lot of natural variability. There's a lot of variability that was already in place before the volcano erupted. So this is a particularly noisy signal, but in the mean, the dark blue line, there's definitely something there. I'm never going to get through all this stuff, so I may start skipping a few slides since I think I have about 15 minutes left. But here's one example. I put it in here because it does link up with the Arctic and things that we did. So here's an example of n equals 3. So we have variability over the Atlantic Ocean. Is this forced? Is this internal? What's the mechanism? These are actively debated topics. So we've estimated the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation index using the Last Millennium Reanalysis, going back for the last 2,000 years. So you know that oscillation you saw is at the far right end of that curve. And then we started saying, well, you know, do we see a spike at around 30 to 50 years over the last millennium? Or was this really a 20th century phenomenon? And the short answer is, when we look at the power spectrum and we account for all the uncertainty and the different ways that we can do this, there's maybe a little bit of a shoulder in that time window, but the dashed line shows you that there's no statistical confidence, no significance against an AR1 null hypothesis. So where you see the bold lines, there is. So this is primarily a red spectrum, and in this wavelet space over the last 2,000 years, you can see there's mainly just more red. There's more power as you go to multi-decadal to centennial timescales, with perhaps a concentration in certain periods of time around 1,000 years ago and maybe during the Little Ice Age. And if we look at the details, we do see a significant peak right around ENSO timescales, but less so on the multi-decadal.
So that would imply it's forced, is the answer to your question?
Seems like what we're seeing during the 20th century is forced, that's right. Yeah. This highlights, sometimes I get the question, well, what are you getting that the climate model doesn't have? And so this is an illustration of that. So if we regress this thick Arctic sea ice thickness, that's what you're seeing in the colors, and concentration in the contours. This is what we get from the CCSM4 Last Millennium simulation. So this is how Arctic sea ice thickness is related to the temperature of the North Atlantic for the AMO. But what it says is, when it's warm over the North Atlantic, there's less sea ice thickness across the Arctic. And in the LMR, we get something similar, but it's not exactly the same. In fact, we find places where the sea ice on the Russian side actually increases when the North Atlantic is warm. These different panels show you that this is a robust signal. So if we go from 0 to 1850, it looks a lot like 1200 to 1850, so we're getting more proxies, and the story is basically the same. And even 1850 to 2000, more or less the same. So it seems to be insensitive to that. This is another interesting one. So this shows you the precipitation, global precipitation, regressed against the AMO. Double ITCZ in the climate model, a chronic bias with most climate models, not in the LMR. So the proxies, they know there's only supposed to be a single ITCZ, and they rectify that. And what they're showing is basically we have a stronger Hadley cell when the Atlantic is warm, and that there's, on the right, we're actually getting the energy transport, polar energy transport from the LMR. And it's radically different from what we have in the climate model. The climate model says when we have a warmer North Atlantic, we're fluxing energy poleward in both hemispheres. And the LMR says we're sending it south across the equator. And that's typically what happens. If the northern hemisphere is warm, we shift the habitable southern to the north, and that's sending energy into the southern hemisphere. The LMR has that. Okay, it's a little bit risky, but let me talk briefly about the planetary radiative imbalance. And it takes that one step further. This is actually not proxies. This is very recent work that's not published yet, but the idea is this is a real reach. Can we reconstruct faithfully the top of the atmosphere radiative fields from proxy measurements? That is, can we deconstruct the outgoing long wave and the short wave? Can we recover Earth's albedo pre-instrumental? We don't even know that very well during the instrumental period prior to the satellite era. So we're seeing how we can do this using instrumental 2-meter temperature data. In the past, we found if we could do that well, the proxies are a good enough estimate of the surface temperature that we should be able to take that back for the last 1,000 years. So what we're looking at here is the only validation we have, and it's only very recently that we're able to do this. So we're going to validate our reconstructions of the top of the atmosphere radiative fields against the series satellite measurements. And those themselves have actually been calibrated against the Argo floats, which are also in the last 20 years, which give the ocean heat content. So the radiative imbalance at the top of the atmosphere should, plus or minus, match up with the changes in the ocean heat content. So this is the outgoing shortwave flux. This is the long wave flux. So this is basically a change in the albedo. This is changes in temperature in clouds. And then this is the net radiative imbalance. And the data simulation reconstruction that we have is in the blue line, and it captures this downtrend observed by satellite in the shortwave flux over the last 20 years. And it actually does a much better job of that than the historical climate simulation that we're sampling from. So we sample prior to this period, so this is out of sample. And then we compare our reconstruction with series, or we can compare that model simulation with series, and reconstruction does a better job. It also does well for the long wave and reasonably well for the radiative imbalance. And again, if you look at the spatial scale, short wave, long wave, energy imbalance with respect to the series, it's pretty good. It's not perfect. Down bottom is the historical climate model simulation, and it lacks that skill in all three of these fields. So we're actually, with the data simulation, we're able to make a more accurate estimate for the last 20 years than the coupled climate model. And then we could then go back to the late 19th century, so there's a lot of interest in things like climate sensitivity as what was going on back in the 19th century. You see a lot of agreement between these curves, and that's a good thing. So here's the satellite period right here. There's a lot to this story that I can't go into, but basically, if you do AMIT experiments where you use known SST distributions and you look at the radiative response of a climate model subject to those, you get the green curve, and then the results of the data simulation, knowing only the surface temperature, are showing the blue curve. And there's good agreement there for all three of these. So basically, this gives us confidence that we can now take this next step, which is to go back pre-instrumental and reconstruct Earth's albedo and the outgoing long wave flux. All right, so let me talk a little bit more about the ocean. So everything up until now is pretty much atmosphere. The ocean has a lot more memory than the atmosphere, and the model part of this problem becomes much more important. To have some memory of the past proxies, we're going to need a model. The models are too expensive. So we're going to use an emulator, a linear inverse model, like Steph mentioned in the introduction, has been transformative for this. This is work that Andre Perkins did. Andre was an undergraduate in this department. He was the second undergraduate, a student from this department that I had as my graduate students, and they've been stellar. So I'm here partly to say a thank you to the water or the faculty here or whatever is going on in Wisconsin. You're producing incredible students. So what we're looking at here is a power spectrum for sea surface temperature and the global average, the Pacific decadal oscillation, the Nino 3.4 index, the North Pacific surface pressure. The blue curve shows the Clement model. The orange curve shows the emulator, shows the linear inverse model. And it shows that the linear inverse model is behaving just like we want it to. It's basically a super lightweight, reliable estimator that has the same forecast skill, as it turns out, as the climate model. So then we can use that in a data simulation. So now we're going to make a forecast. We're going to retain the memory of last year's analysis when we do the data simulation, just like we do in weather forecasting. And we're going to march that forward. And that makes a big difference. If you look at the northern hemisphere temperature, when we do that, we actually get a much colder state going back to the last 1,000 years. And no matter how we change, how we do this, we get something similar. So this is a real departure from what we found in the past. And this dashed black line right here is, you could say, the one true physical measurement we have of the recent past. So this is borehole thermometry. So basically, if you drop a thermometer down a borehole, including ice cores, and then you solve the heat equation, you can infer what the temperature must have been. So there's error bars on this to get big as you go back. But they've always suggested that it was colder than we're getting from these tree ring dominated records. We're starting to see something a little closer to that with this. Down below, you're looking at validation of this reconstruction against the Aura 20Cs. This is a coupled ocean reanalysis. And so for sea surface temperature and upper ocean heat content, again, from proxies, we're getting pretty similar answers. And you see that in these time series as well. SST, Nino 3.4, upper ocean heat content, Pacific decadal oscillation. Black curve shows the Last Millennium Reanalysis using the online. Offline doesn't get this. The memory is really, really important. So ocean heat content this is really encouraging. So this is Zana et al., the blue curve, 2019, probably the best estimate we have right now over the last 100 years or so. And the Last Millennium Reanalysis is really similar to that. And we also get very favorable comparisons for Nino 3.4 and even the PDO for that matter. Okay, Arctic sea ice. I think I'm going to leave it here as the last topic, just to put in context the satellite era. Again, how does that change in sea ice? What is the context for that? Well, here's the context. Over the last 2,000 years, you can see there's a lot of variability. There was a buildup, an increase of Arctic sea ice over the last 1,000 years, reached a peak here in the Little Ice Age. And if you look at the details, during the last 150 years, the black curve this is Katie Brennan's work, of whatever PhD thesis, is the black line. There's two. This is instrumental assimilation, and then we have reconstructions in the brown, the purple, and in the blue, once again accounting for the uncertainty in the various sources. And they all show, I can point this out, but the biggest change in the last millennium came early in the 20th century. So that's the biggest reduction in Arctic sea ice in the last millennium. It occurred with something called the early 20th century warming. And that was nearly as big as what's occurred during the satellite era up until about the last 5 to 10 years. And then that's really taken us into uncharted territory. So the early 20th century warming is bigger than people thought it was before. It's actually a subject of current research that my group is working on. To put this into context, this looks at trends over the entire last 2,000 years relative to the satellite era. And the satellite era for 20-year trends, especially 30-year trends, When you get to 30-year trends and longer, there's nothing in the last 2,000 years that compares with what's happening in this atmosphere. It is completely out of sample. We're in the tail of distribution with 20-year trends. You could have said maybe 10 years ago, well, this is within the realm of natural variability of the last millennium. We've left what's happened in the last 2,000 years. All right, I think I'm going to leave it there. We've also done a lot of linear inverse modeling and decadal prediction. I'll tell you more about that. But let me close with what I think is the most exciting part. If you're a student, this is a super exciting time, I think. There's new opportunities that we've never had before. So the LMR and others like it. These are still primitive early days for this fusion of information from proxies and climate models that we really need to get large samples to understand variability in the climate system. And I would say, what I'm most excited about in the AI revolution that we're going through right now is to have the ability for fast emulators of climate models to capture both weather, space and time scales, and the possibility for doing this over really long time scales. That is, look at weather statistics over paleoclimate time scales. Yeah, I think there's lots of opportunities here to merge what I just showed you, instrumental and proxies. Biggest bang for the buck might very well be how do we better model these proxy system models, that is, predict the proxies from the climate state. And we even have ways of objectively identifying the best places to go next if you wanted to gather another proxy archive to target new information. Sorry I blasted you with too much information, but that's what I wanted to share. Thank you very much for your patience.
Any questions from students?
Before the faculty decide to take over? And
Students, do you feel like do you see the message here, the opportunity? Like if you wanted to understand how is a certain phenomenon changing? How are extratropical cyclones changing? How are summer frosts? Like what is the probability of a summer frost? You know, anything, we're really limited by what we have in reanalysis data, which is really satellite era. You can stretch it, and we have going back to maybe the 20th century. It's still small sample during forced climate. We really, really need something bigger than that. Yeah, Rudy.
Yeah, I guess one thing that confused me is what's the temporal resolution when you do this thing of simulations, like because these extreme events might be short-lived. They can be like within days or so instead of months. Does this method enables us to capture those short-term events as well, or is it not that much?
I would say that's still an open question. So clearly we can see signals and alias onto, at the very least, onto annual timescales because we see them. That volcanic eruption composite was an example of that. But my suspicion is if you bring a climate model in and you subject it to these boundary conditions, you might be able to, we're not going to get into individual events. We're not going to be able to say, on December 13th in the year 1701, there was an East Coast, there was an nor'easter, and here are the details of it. But I think we will be able to say the statistics have changed in systematic ways in these years. Some things were more likely and other things were less likely. And I still think that's useful information. And it's still a frontier research problem. Yeah.
When you eventually go down sub-annual resolution, how do you plan to determine seasonal shifts from, I don't know how best to word this, but if it's outside of what is reasonable for a seasonal cycle versus what is changing over multiple hundreds of years? Does that make sense?
It very much does, yeah. So basically the question is about seasonality, uncertainty in seasonality in the proxy records. This is an issue through a lot of problems in paleoclimate. So right now we are modeling the trees seasonally, even though we only have typically an annual record. But we know some of those tree ring archives, for example, late wood density. So the cell density in these tree rings in the later part of the growing season is almost like a thermometer. Like that's a really accurate estimate of temperature at that time. So there are some that we're quite confident in. Others, especially when you start bringing in soil moisture where there may be lead and lag effects, are hard to model. Corals also have all the way down to monthly resolution. For some archives, they actually cut them down that fine. So yeah, it's very much proxy dependent, and there's a bit of uncertainty, especially as you go subannual. So I don't know the answer, but I think there are certain archives which are going to give us an advantage in pursuing that.
How good is the proxy system model for timing of volcanic eruptions? Because if you know the amount in the Greenland ice sheet and the amount in the Antarctic ice sheet, that's a pair of pretty particular information, and you could run a global model to over and over again, but figuring out where do volcanic eruptions go in each season on average. Is that getting close to being pretty good?
Yeah, a lot of the aerosol loading information, these volcanic horizons in the ice core records, they're globally synchronous, and that is often a way to kind of benchmark a lot of these proxies so that they...
Sometimes they show up first in one year.
Yeah,
and then
yeah.
the other
There's
year.
definitely a plus or minus 1 year, and you may have noticed that. There's a little bit, so in, I'm just trying to find it. Here. In some of these composites that I've done, you can actually see cooling in the year before the volcanic eruption, because there is a little bit of blurring across the lines,
Yeah.
especially you don't
Not
know
sure which
exactly
year.
what it is. So it's plus or minus a year, I think, is fair. Even though most of these are reliably, absolutely dated to within that. Now, when you start getting into deeper time in other archives, time uncertainty becomes more. So for ocean sediment core proxies, for example, we have to explicitly account for and sample over dating uncertainty. And really what dating uncertainty does, it basically is a smoother over the climate signals. You introduce some uncertainty about when things happen.
Can I ask a couple of questions about this graph?
Sure.
Because my understanding of the northern annular mode is that when in the last century, about 10 out of the 11 eruptions rendered a high index circulation, which made Europe warm, but that's one thing. Interior of North America and Europe is, in the winter time, warmer. And is that removed from the signal? And the other one is, if that's true, how do you get these big blacking highs in the North Pacific and South Pacific? There's a pair of them. And that's a low index one.
Yeah, so all I can say is there's a lot of variability in these volcanic eruptions. And so limiting an analysis to a small sample may very well give you different answers. For example, there's a bit of controversy, there's actually a lot of controversy about whether El Nino events follow large volcanic eruptions. And for a while, it was thought, yes, they do. No, they don't. The issue that we've come up with recently is a small sample. We don't have enough events to say for sure one way or the other.
Another strange
So
thing
do
to
you
say
in the
about-
last millennium, do you in this,
No,
in
I
this
don't
data
think so.
set have enough events?
I don't think so.
Still not enough
No.
events?
Yeah, I mean, it's still, it's depending on how low you put your threshold for the magnitude of the volcanic event. You're still dealing with order 20 to 25, something like that. The big ones, it's much smaller. So yeah, it's still too small a sample. The variability is large. Not good. Yeah, John.
Oh, Greg, can you do fun things like this? Like say, what's the wintertime circulation north of 40 degrees, and do a time series of that, even if you have to do 5-year intervals?
Yeah, absolutely.
You can.
Absolutely.
Oh, that's really neat.
Yeah, you could do your diagnostic on, even anomalies from zonal symmetry.
Yeah,
And waviness.
Can I add one more question? What's the limiting scale? Because you've done so much excellent work, you and your group, with TPVs, and they're kind of a way to think about how the circulation is actually put together in the cold season.
Yeah.
What scale can you get down to, do you think? Because you're looking at radiative imbalance at the top of the atmosphere. I imagine you could do something similar at the tropopause or in the upper troposphere, but with less confidence, maybe?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Probably depends on where you are.
Yeah.
the resolution of the proxy archive, but I think, even down to sub 1,000-kilometer scale, it's probably getting dicey.
Yeah, okay. But you could do an annulus around the pole and say this year or this set of years
Yes.
has a little more PV substance,
Yes.
a little more circulation than these years that
Yes.
didn't, and
Yes.
maybe that you leave it at that.
Yeah, and like you're suggesting, whenever you have the opportunity to average or to filter to larger scales in space and in time, the signal will be more robust.
Okay, yeah, that's very interesting.
So is this data publicly available?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
You go to
so
your website?
my website, NCEI is hosting the LMR, except for the LMR Online, that's only available on my site. Yeah, because NOAA funded the 20th Century Reanalysis. Yeah, so we should acknowledge sponsors. NSF sponsored the basic research leading up to it. NOAA funded the 20th Century Reanalysis, and the Heising-Simons Foundation funded its extension back to the last glacial maximum. Yeah, Dan.
So, I mean, it's really amazing the amount of information you're getting from these proxy data. I think
Yeah.
that speaks to the Kalman filter and the methodology here. So, in breaking that out and thinking like, where are you going to get more information? Are you going to get it from the forward models? Are you going to get it from more proxy data? Are you limited by the number of forward models that you have to simulate the proxy data? And is that what's limiting your ability to bring in more data? Like, where are you going?
Yeah, I think you're right, that if we can better model the proxies, we don't have to go gather new ones, right? So we're talking about 50 years to get all the ones that we have. We'll probably take another 50 years to double that. So we really need to get more information out of the ones that we have. And we've done very, very crude modeling. This is linear regression, right? I showed you some of these plots. They're noisy as all get out, right? But there's a little bit of signal there. The problem is for people who have done this modeling with fancier, so there are models that do sophisticated tree ring growth modeling. And the problem is that they're sensitive to the bias in the climate model prior that you give to them. The trees won't even grow if the model has too much of a cold bias, or there's a soil moisture bias. So these absolute biases, they have to be absolutely calibrated, not relative calibrated, which is what we have here. So I think this is another really exciting area, and bang for the buck, it's probably the biggest hook we have going forward to get more information out of these archives. Climate models too, but that's
Yeah, I
also
mean, I do wonder about that as well, like the mean state of these models,
let's get rid of the double ITCZ.
Yeah, that'd be nice.
Yeah.
But you see the same thing in statistical downscaling as well, that you're better off training on like incept reanalysis than something really that does a good job, because you want that smoother
Yep.
to not
Inherit the bias.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, like in terms of the proxy data you're using though, I mean, there's, what other data is out there that you could be using? Is there other proxy data you could be using that you don't have models for?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of it.
Yeah.
A lot of it. So pollen assemblage records are kind of a huge database that goes back over the Holocene. As far as I know, there are only inverse relationships. That is, they've done this recovered temperature from the pollen. We really want to go the other way. We really want to predict the pollen assemblage data from the temperature. And that, as far as I know, doesn't exist. And there are lots of other records like that. Like there are lake records with all sorts of lipid proxies that tell us lots of things about precipitation that, again, they have inverse models for, but not forward models. So it's cool. I mean, people will develop, they are developing those right now. So this field didn't exist 10, 15 years ago, and now it's a thriving subdiscipline.
Can you also, sorry.
In a lot of your correlation plots, the southern hemisphere dropped away, as you showed with the
Yeah.
proxy record is quite low
Yeah.
down there.
Yeah.
And a lot of your results, you were either global or northern hemisphere focused.
Yeah.
Does this pose a concern if we try and focus on Southern Ocean, Antarctic sea ice stuff, and the whole record that you have in your model, considering that it is at much lower resolution and
I think
correlation
so,
down there?
yeah. Especially for the last millennium, we're so northern hemisphere biased. Ironically, even though the resolution of the archives becomes coarser, when you go to the ocean sediment records, they're actually a little more heterogeneously distributed. There's a lot more southern hemisphere information there. So for the LGMR, which is the last glacial extension of the LMR, there's a fair bit more sampling there. And the ability, so we didn't use the ice core records, but when we independently validate against them and speleothems and latitudes, we actually get fairly decent agreement with that out of sample validation.
Kind of a related question, which is, can you also use this data somehow to get it where it would be most useful to come up with more proxies or like drill?
Yeah, so that
cores
was the last.
Oh, did I miss that? That was, targeting proxies.
Yeah, and actually, so the surprising result here, so we applied this to corals, because corals are still just kind of active sampling of corals. There's a lot of important information we still need in the tropical Pacific. One of the interesting things we found is that replicates are really important. You know, my hypothesis going into that is that we need to go places where we don't have them right now, right? There's a hole in the network. Let's go there and get that coral. And what this said is that, no, there are some places where we need to scrunch the uncertainty, even though we've sampled it already, because the spatial scale that it captures is so extensive in some parts of the Central Pacific.
So that would be like
You learn about this spot, you learn about pretty much everything. So go there and reduce the uncertainty.
Yeah, we have temperature gradient dynamics. Yeah.
And there's really cool, postdoc Sarah Sanchez has done a really cool study looking at corals in the South Pacific Convergence Zone and how they highlight this bias in the climate models between that and the Central Pacific that really affects the data simulation. It almost makes it unusable for those corals. Yeah, like this is where the model bias really becomes a problem in the tropical Pacific.
Interesting. Interesting.
Back of the room, come on, the front of the room is leading the race here.
All right, well, if there's no any additional questions, we are right at time, so let's thank Greg one last time.